Chicago, Illinois, the third largest city in the United States, had a mayor. It had police. It had laws. But the man who really ruled was a 28-year-old with a scar on his face who never won an election. Al Capone made $100 million a year, more than General Motors at the time. Adjusted for today, that's over $1.5 billion. Judges, cops, politicians, they all worked for him, and the entire city knew it. For nearly a decade, Chicago lived under the same conditions that would one day define cartel-controlled cities in Colombia and Mexico. Chicago wasn't an American city, a place where one man owns the police, the courts, and the silence. One man above the law. This is Chicago on 20s. February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day. 7 men were called to a garage on Clark Street, members of the rival Bugs Moran gang. They thought they were picking up a shipment of smuggled whiskey. A car pulled up, men dressed as police officers got out. They walked into the garage, lined the 7 men against the wall. Police, hands up! And then, 70 rounds in less than 10 seconds, 7 bodies on the floor. No witnesses, or at least, none willing to talk. The entire country stopped. Newspapers called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But in Chicago, everyone understood the message. The city had an owner. But it wasn't always like this. Chicago wasn't born corrupt. Before Al Capone, before the massacres, before the fear, Chicago was the city of second chances, the place where European immigrants came to build a life, where factories offered work, and work offered a future. In 1871, a fire destroyed the entire city, but Chicago rose from the ashes. In 50 years, it grew from 30,000 people to over 2 million. The second largest city in America, the industrial capital of the Midwest. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And the future looked bright, until a law changed everything. If New York had its roaring 20s, Chicago had its bleeding 20s, and the blood started with an outsider. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was not born in Chicago. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up in the streets of the Lower East Side, where he learned that the law served whoever paid the most. At 14, he was already in the game. At 18, he took a razor to the face in a bar fight. 3 deep cuts, the scar that would define him for the rest of his life. He worked for Johnny Torrio, one of the most powerful men in New York's underworld. And in 1919, Torrio made him an offer. Come to Chicago. There's an opportunity. January 16, 1920, the United States government banned alcohol. Torrio saw what no one else saw, the greatest business opportunity in American history. Capone took a train. He arrived in Chicago as an employee. He would leave it as a king. When Capone arrived, Chicago already had owners. Big Jim Colosimo controlled the brothels and the cops. Johnny Torrio controlled the business. But Colosimo didn't want to touch alcohol. Too risky, he said. Torrio disagreed. May 11, 1920. Colosimo was murdered in his own restaurant. 2 bullets in the back. No one was arrested. Torrio took over everything. And Capone, from bodyguard to partner. They divided Chicago like a chessboard. Every neighborhood, a territory. Every territory, a supplier. Every supplier, a payment. The machine was built. All that was left was to eliminate anyone who wouldn't bow. They didn't negotiate. They didn't warn. If you refused to pay, you disappeared. If you worked for the wrong gang, you disappeared. Chicago learned fast. You either worked for Capone or you didn't work at all. By 1925, Johnny Torrio had enough. He'd been shot, nearly killed. He handed Capone the keys to the kingdom and left for Italy. At 26 years old, Al Capone became the most powerful man in Chicago. Al Capone didn't run a gang. He ran a corporation. The Chicago outfit was a business. Illegal breweries hidden across the city. Protected transportation routes. Distributors in every neighborhood. And a payroll that included cops, judges, aldermen, and the mayor himself. Capone paid $30 million a year in bribes. He made $100 million. He didn't hide. He went to restaurants, public events, baseball games. Reporters interviewed him. Politicians posed next to him. In 1927, Mayor Big Bill Thompson returned to power. Everyone in Chicago knew who paid for his campaign. Chicago no longer had a government, it had an owner, and he was 28 years old. But not everyone bowed. The North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran, still controlled part of the city. Capone decided that had to end, and he would send a message the entire world would hear. For nearly a decade, Chicago lived under the laws of Al Capone, not the laws of the government. His laws. Cops didn't arrest without his permission. Judges didn't convict those he protected. Newspapers didn't print what he didn't want. Chicago had become something else. It was no longer an American city. It was a kingdom, and Capone was the king. He ruled from the Lexington Hotel. 50 rooms guarded day and night. All the wealth, all the glamour, built on blood and fear. And he didn't hide it. He showed the world what power looked like. Because who was going to arrest him? The police worked for him. The mayor worked for him. Chicago was his. And here's the thing most people don't understand. A lot of Chicagoans loved him. During the Depression, Capone opened soup kitchens, fed thousands, paid for hospital bills, gave money to struggling families, to the people on the streets. Al Capone wasn't a monster. He was the man who kept them alive when their own government had abandoned them. That's how power works. Fear buys silence, loyalty buys time. But Chicago couldn't save itself. It couldn't. The police worked for Capone. The judges worked for Capone. Even the mayor worked for Capone. Salvation had to come from the outside. Washington sent federal agents. The Prohibition Bureau deployed the Untouchables, a team led by Eliot Ness that Capone couldn't buy, and Treasury investigators quietly built the case that would finally bring him down. Taxes, October 17, 1931. Al Capone was convicted, not for murder, not for bootlegging, for tax evasion, 11 years in prison, Alcatraz. But prison was the least of his punishments. Capone had contracted syphilis years earlier, and without treatment, the disease destroyed his brain. By his 40s, neurosyphilis had hollowed him out. The king who ruled a city struggled to remember names. January 25, 1947, Palm Island, Florida. Al Capone died at 48 years old, far from Chicago, far from power, far from everything. There was no king's funeral, no tributes. The most feared man in America died forgotten. But the name remained. Al Capone died, but he did something no mayor, no industrialist, no athlete ever did. He put Chicago on the map of the world, not the map of the United States, the map of the world. Ask someone in Tokyo, in Mumbai, in Paris. What do you know about Chicago? The answer always comes back to the same name. Over 100 movies have been made about him, dozens of TV series, hundreds of books. Other names came from Chicago, athletes who changed basketball, presidents who changed the country. But none are as universally recognized as the man with a scar on his face. As terrible as he was, as many lives as he destroyed, Al Capone made Chicago immortal. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. The city he almost destroyed will never be forgotten because of him. Chicago tried to erase Capone, but Capone never left Chicago. The scar remains. For nearly a decade, Chicago belonged to one man, a man who bought the police, the judges, and the silence. A man who came from somewhere else and took a city as his own. A man who proved that power doesn't need a ballot. It just needs money, fear, and a city willing to look away. Chicago rose from the ashes once, but the shadow of Al Capone never left.